Imagine wagering everything on a single hand of cards, your fortune, your pride, even your own daughter. What if that reckless bet shattered an entire empire of wealth and power? In the shadowy depths of antebellum America, one man's hubris ignited a chain of events that defied the laws of society, turning slaves into owners and a privileged heiress into a pawn in a desperate fight for freedom. Buckle up, because this forgotten tale from the heart of the South will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about history. The year is 1852, in the sweltering, stifling heat of Natchez, Mississippi. A county registrar named Henry Clark sits bent over a record book, the aroma of aged parchment and candle wax heavy in his cramped, musty chamber. Beyond the shuttered window, the clamor of the town filters in the clatter of carriage wheels on the cobblestone streets, the far-off whistle of a paddle-wheeler on the river. But Clark hears none of it. His focus is locked on a lone paper that has landed on his desk, a transfer deed that defies logic, a formal contract that feels like a fragment ripped from a lunatic's journal. It is a typical sales bill composed on sturdy cotton rag paper. The script is bold, a short ebony against the ivory. The juridical phrasing is exact, endorsements verified, the official stamp a flawless crimson imprint. Yet the substance is a monstrosity, a breach of the fundamental order as Clark and every resident in the county comprehends it. The asset being conveyed is not acreage, not animals, not tobacco or rice. The asset is a human being. This in itself is sadly routine. Clark logs such deals every day. The frigid calculus of human servitude. But this deed stands apart. The individual being traded is not a nameless laborer acquired from a Memphis broker. The name inscribed in Richard Beaumont's refined, flowing script is Elizabeth Ann Beaumont. His offspring, 19 years old, the renowned gem of Adams County. A young lady of flawless Anglo-Saxon heritage, acclaimed for her elegance and poised for a union that would merge two of the region's most influential lineages. And the purchasers, this is the element that chills Clark's veins. The element that causes him to sense the pillars of his reality starting to fracture. The purchasers are noted as four persons, their identities listed with eerie plainness. Elias, Isaac, Levi, and Zeke. There are no family names because they possess none. They are the chattel of Richard Beaumont himself. Four of his own bonded laborers. The paper declares in wording stripped of any sentiment that Miss Elizabeth Beaumont is hereby conveyed, assigned and handed over to them to be their holding eternally. The sale amount, noted in the lower left, is the ultimate macabre affront, $5. Clark peruses the paper once more, and then a fourth time. His thoughts battle to construct the details into a logical truth. Richard Beaumont, the richest, hottest, and most dreaded landowner in a 200-mile span. A man whose hereditary estate, Oak Ridge, was a true realm of rice and forced toil, had traded his own progeny to four of his bondsmen. The paper provides only a lone, enigmatic rationale for this deed of societal and kinship obliteration. In resolution of a stake forfeited, a gamble, a risk, a contest of fortune had resulted in this. The revelation, when it leaks from the bounds of Clark's chamber, which it does before the moon rises, does not merely circulate. It erupts. It journeys from the registry to the taverns, from the shopkeepers' facades to the porches of the villas. It is borne by chattering attendants back to the vast estates that border the waterway, murmured in pantries and barns, in laborer huts, and in the lavish parlors of the Anglo elite. Elizabeth Beaumont, traded to bondsmen. Her sire's bondsmen. The outrage is so deep, so completely beyond the limits of conceivable conduct that it overshadows all other matters. The cost of rice, the impending yield, the brewing governmental strains in the capital, all recede into obscurity. The sole narrative that counts is the one transpiring at Oak Ridge. The idyllic vision that had abruptly turned into a living horror. Oak Ridge. Even the title evoked an idealized realm, a landowner's utopia hewn from the scorching Mississippi wilds. The primary residence was a triumph of neoclassical design. Its soaring ivory pillars ascending like timeless guardians from a trimmed meadow that descended toward the turbid, swirling currents of the river. Ancient pecans, twisted and weathered, cloaked in veils of hanging lichen, bordered the vista, their shades cascading over hectares upon hectares of rice that gleamed emerald and amber in the relentless sunlight. For eras, the Beaumonts had governed this terrain. They were venerable Anglo-Saxon nobility who followed their ancestry back to the British settlement period, and they regarded the ambitious newcomers who were inundating Mississippi with a blend of scorn and disdain. Their authority was total, their riches vast, their title equivalent to custom and supremacy. At the core of this lineage stood Richard Beaumont, a gentleman in his mid-50s. He bore the stern, attractive traits of his forebears, but his gaze contained a turbulent, perilous blaze. He was a figure of insatiable cravings for riches, for dominance, and for peril. He oversaw Oak Ridge with merciless precision. But his genuine fervor resided at the betting parlors of Memphis and on the paddle-wheelers that navigated the mighty stream. He was a being of sheer arrogance, a man who thought the norms that ruled inferior beings did not pertain to him. He viewed the cosmos as a magnificent contest, and he was persuaded he could never be defeated. His daughter Elizabeth was the incarnation of all he aimed to safeguard and display: innocence, pedigree, and allure. Nurtured from infancy to be the ideal Southern maiden, she was skilled in piano and Latin, her gestures poised, her demeanor modest. To the external realm, she was a china figurine, a being of radiance and ether, drifting through the sumptuous chambers of Oak Ridge. Her existence a proof of her sire's standing. She was the supreme emblem of his triumph, the treasure he would someday tactically position in the diadem of another mighty clan to assure the Beaumont heritage for another era. And then there were the four. They were not outsiders to the folks of the county. They were staples of the Beaumont estate. Men whose existences were as tied to Oak Ridge as the willow trees were to the bayou. Elias was the senior, a man in his 60s with complexion the hue of deep mahogany and eyes that had witnessed excess. He was the supervisor of the rice processing, a role of vast accountability. He elicited regard, not via terror, but via a serene, steadfast proficiency. He had been birthed at Oak Ridge, as had his parent before him. Isaac was the forger, a colossus of a figure whose mighty limbs could fit a mule or craft a sickle with equal expertise. His quietude was frequently confused for naivety, but beneath his impassive exterior was a sharp, perceptive intellect. He was the bodily might of the four. Levi was the woodworker, his palms adept at forming the local willow into refined furnishings for the grand residence or robust shacks for the huts. He perceived the world in contours and corners, in frameworks that could be erected or demolished. Nathan was the chief groom, a man who comprehended mules better than he comprehended humans. He held a tender grasp that could soothe the most lively colt, and it was rumored he could discern a mule's ideas in the twitch of its mane. He knew every trail and every concealed route in the county. And finally, Zeke the Junior, scarcely 22 years old. A domestic attendant who had matured in the umbra of the grand residence itself. Unlike the others, Zeke could decipher and inscribe, a mystery he protected as tightly as his existence. He was swift-minded, attentive, and navigated through the domain of the white overlords with a hushed, nearly unseen poise. And in his core, he fostered a frigid, enduring flame of resistance. These were the men who, now, according to a lawfully enforceable paper, possessed Elizabeth Beaumont. The disclosure generated a numbing condition of mental discord in the white populace. How was one to digest such an occurrence? Was it a calamity, a comedy, an episode of lunacy? The juridical structure that sustained their whole society. The strict separation between white and black, liberated and bound, possessor and asset, had been pulverized by one of Richard Beaumont's imprudent contests. On the day the deed was carried out, a harrowing parade occurred at Oak Ridge. Two of the county marshal's assistants, their expressions somber and perspiring in the noon blaze, appeared to supervise the handover. They were there not to halt it, but to guarantee the statute, however deranged, was adhered to. Richard Beaumont did not emerge. He had barricaded himself in his library, a flask of whiskey, his sole associate. The noise of a lone, anguished wail sporadically fleeing the sturdy maple portal. His spouse Amelia had plummeted into a condition of frenzied immobility, tended by her intimate attendants. It was the superintendent, a rough fellow named Harlan, who escorted Elizabeth out onto the terrace. She was attired in a plain beige afternoon gown, her golden tresses drawn back from a visage that was ashen and completely devoid of expression. She did not weep. She did not utter. She proceeded with an odd, disturbing serenity, as if she were a performer in a drama whose conclusion she already foresaw. The four men lingered at the base of the stairs. They were not in their labor garb, but in the neat, basic attire they donned on Sundays. They positioned united, a mute, imposing group. Elias advanced as Elizabeth descended the steps. He did not extend for her, did not contact her. He merely tilted his head, a motion of recognition that was unfathomable to decipher. The superintendent, Harlan, ejected a jet of chewing tobacco into the soil. "She's yours now," he jeered, the terms oozing with a combination of revulsion and incredulity. "The law declares it. Heaven preserve us all." Elizabeth passed him without a peek. She halted before the four men, her stare encountering Elias's for a fleeting, indecipherable instant. Then, with the assistants and the superintendent observing in astonished quietude, the four men pivoted, and with Elizabeth striding amid them, they departed from the grand residence. They did not escort her to the laborer huts, that assortment of rough shanties where the hundreds of other bound individuals of Oak Ridge existed and perished. Instead, they guided her along a shaded trail distant from the primary areas of the estate, toward an isolated or looked nook of the property, leaving behind a hush saturated with the thunderous buzz of a myriad unresolved queries, the most urgent of which lingered in the atmosphere like the muggy mist off the stream. What sort of man stakes his own daughter? And what in the divine name were for bondsmen to do with a white maiden they now lawfully possessed? To comprehend how a man could stake his own daughter, we must journey back to years to the autumn of 1850. This was the pinnacle of Oak Ridge, the summit of the Beaumont lineage's dominance. The rice flourished, dense and high, vowing a bumper crop. The grand residence sparkled with gatherings, its spaces brimming with the mirth of the Anglo elite, the fragrance of jasmine flowers, and the tacit, omnipresent toil of the bound. From the exterior, Oak Ridge was the flawless embodiment of the landowner class's idyllic self-portrait, a realm of refinement, dignity, and affluence, decreed by the Almighty and constructed on a bedrock of unchallenged white dominance. But beneath this glossy facade, the bedrock was decaying. The decay was in the essence of its overlord, Richard Beaumont. His conceit had soured into a form of insanity, a faith in his own impeccability that required perpetual imprudent validation. His betting was not simply a flaw, 'twas a stage of authority. He didn't merely stake on dice. He staked on existences, on the caprices of the elements, on the resilience of human agony, demonstrating to himself in the realm that all and every one was a token in his contest. His peer landowners conversed in subdued, semi-admiring intonations of his fabled stakes. There was the occasion he staked $2,000 that his sturdiest harvester could haul a mature ox 200 yards. The individual spine was shattered in the effort. There was the notorious contest against a paddle wheeler, where Richard wagered his champion mare could surpass the vessel on a 10-mile segment along the riverbank. A contest that concluded with the horse crumpling, its breath faltering. Richard had the beast dispatched where it toppled and serenely requested another beverage. Each defeat, each deed of nonchalant brutality only appeared to stoke his compulsion, his necessity for a superior, more conclusive triumph to obliterate the blemish of his setbacks. This was the realm Elizabeth occupied, an ornate enclosure where the barriers were formed of asphyxiating anticipations. At 17, she was being prepared for her debut into Memphis society, and more crucially, for the matrimony her sire had already orchestrated. Her betrothed was a gentleman thrice her age, an affluent Anglo named Lord Edward Fontaine, whose immense rice holdings adjoined the Beaumont territories. It was an ideal pairing on parchment, a unification of authority that would forge a dominion. But Elizabeth knew, as all in their sphere murmured, that the Lord was a figure of icy desires and a ferocious disposition, a man whose initial 3 spouses had expired youthful and under faintly sorrowful conditions. Elizabeth navigated her days with a hushed, rehearsed tranquility, but her gaze bore a veiled vigilance. She observed the nonchalant savagery her sire distributed. She observed the dread in the gazes of the domestic attendants when he was in a sour temper. She sensed the smothering burden of her own destiny, a perpetual sentence to be endured in the majestic abode of a fiend. A silent insurgency brewed within her. It revealed in minor, nearly imperceptible manners. A pilfered volume of verse shared with Zeke in the study. An additional serving of nourishment slipped to a youngster from the huts. A prolonged sympathetic gaze sustained to extend it with an attendant who had just been chastised. Her sire perceived these instances as womanly tenderness, a frailty to be pampered before it was eradicated by the truths of wedlock. He had no notion they were the sparks of a blaze that would ultimately devour his whole realm. He especially rebuked her for her closeness with Zeke. He is an attendant Elizabeth, a fragment of asset, Richard had once barked, witnessing her in subdued dialogue with the young fellow. They are not akin to us. They do not sense as we do. To regard them as confidants is to beckon turmoil. Recall your rank. Elizabeth had merely dropped her eyes and whispered, "Yes, father." But the glance she exchanged with Zeke as her sire turned aside was one of unadulterated, unrefined collusion. While the grand residence functioned on a subtle waltz of societal ceremony, another realm subsisted just past the row of pecans, the huts. Here a lively and tenacious society persevered. Life was regulated not by ballroom timetables, but by the unyielding cadence of the daylight and the superintendent's scourge. Yet in the twilights after the exhausting drudgery in the paddies and the rice processor, a distinct heritage proclaimed itself. It was a realm of communal tales, of botanical cures transmitted from African progenitors, of melodies that bore encoded communications of grief and aspiration. A covert web of data, the Whisper Network, linked them to other estates up and down the stream. They knew which overlords were savage and which were simply apathetic. They knew when enforcers were out in strength. They knew of flights, triumphant and botched. And they knew better than anyone the authentic character of the man who possessed their forms, but not their essences. Each of the 4 men who would one day possess Elizabeth bore his own tally with Richard Beaumont, a record of individual wrongs that stoked a yearning for a settlement for Elias, the supervisor. The injury was 25 years ancient, but had never mended. To resolve a betting obligation, Richard had traded Elias's spouse, Hannah, to a tobacco estate in Alabama. He had vowed to repurchase her within 2 years. The years elapsed, then another and another. Elias's questions were encountered with annoyance, then fury, then menaces. He ultimately discovered through the Whisper Network that Hannah had succumbed to malaria 3 years after being traded. He never mentioned her again, but the recollection of her was a frigid, solid pebble in his breast. Isaac the forger bore the load of his labor in his essence as well as his sinews. He was the one Richard summoned to craft the devices of restraint. The metal neckbands, the ankle chains, the stamps used to label fugitive bondsmen. Each impact of his mallet on the scorching alloy was a strike against his own kin, a collusion imposed upon him that corroded his spirit. He toiled in quietude, his countenance a veil of perspiration and grime, beseeching for the day his vigor could be employed for emancipation instead of tyranny. Levi, the woodworker, had envisioned constructing a modest sanctuary for the society in the huts, a locale to assemble and besiege with a honor the overlord's chapel would never provide them. He had expended weeks sketching blueprints, procuring the appropriate timber. When he modestly submitted the concept to Richard, his overlord had chortled in his visage. A sanctuary for them. Richard had derided, "They can besiege in the paddies where they pertain." The very subsequent day, he commanded Levi to commence erection on a capricious new autumn pavilion by the stream. A tribute to the overlord's fancies constructed with the lumber Levi had reserved for his sanctuary. Nathan's anguish was for a being that could not articulate. He had nurtured a splendid gray mare, Athena, from a foal. The horse was his honor, a testament to his aptitude. When Richard had compelled the horse into the doomed contest against the paddle-wheeler, Nathan had implored him to rethink, alerting that the creature's core would rupture. Richard had smacked him across the cheek with his riding whip. Nathan had been compelled to observe his cherished Athena dash to her demise, and then was commanded to excavate the horse's burial. For Zeke, the wrong was a perpetual daily torment. As a domestic attendant, he was an unseen observer to the Beaumont's realm. He observed the duplicity, the sham devotion, the nonchalant savagery masked as courtesy. He observed the horror in Elizabeth's gaze when her sire debated her matrimony to the Lord. He observed her essence diminishing in that splendid abode. And because he could decipher, he had entry to a realm of concepts that was prohibited to him. In the periodicals he gathered for his overlord, he perused of emancipation movements in the East, of bondsman uprisings in the islands. He commenced to trust that another realm was feasible, and a frantic, bold scheme began to shape in his intellect. He was the tactician, the nerve hub of the impending tempest. The trigger for the catastrophe was a man named Jonathan Dupree. While the Beaumonts were Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, Dupree was a Yankee, a self-forged man who had scraped his way to affluence through venture and an astute, unsentimental method to the rice enterprise. Richard loathed him, perceiving him as a coarse being of fresh wealth, a man with no legacy and no honor. Dupree, in turn, perceived Richard as a decadent remnant, a strutter whose elegant plumage concealed a feeble and foolish core. Their antagonism was the gossip of the county, an acrid enmity that unfolded in territory quarrels, commercial pacts, and most fiercely at the betting board. The arena for the ultimate scene of this antagonism was established in the winter of 1850 aboard the Delta Princess, a opulent paddle-wheeler executing its bi-weekly voyage from Memphis to Vicksburg. In the men's lounge, a high-risk blackjack competition was progressing. The atmosphere was a choking haze of pipe smoke, the tinkling of tumblers, and the gentle shuffle of decks punctuated by subdued mutterings and sporadic eruptions of amusement. At the focal board sat Richard Beaumont and Jonathan Dupree. For hours, the contest persisted. The heaps of silver coins and promissory notes oscillated to and fro across the scarlet bays. Richard, propelled by whiskey and his own endless conceit, was competing heedlessly. Dupree competed with a frigid, predatory endurance, permitting Richard to secure minor pots, nourishing his vanity, luring him further into the snare. As the evening advanced and the river shore glided by in the gloom, Richard's deficits started to accumulate. He lost currency, then bonds, then the title to a modest tract of terrain. With each deficit, his countenance grew murkier, his actions more unpredictable. Ultimately, near dawn, it reduced to a lone, colossal round. Richard was almost eradicated. The other competitors at the board had discreetly withdrawn, satisfied to observe the two giants clash. Dupree reclined in his seat, a slender grin toying on his mouth. "It appears your fortune has evaporated this evening, Beaumont." Richard's gaze sparked. "The evening is not concluded. Dupree, declare your terms for one ultimate round." Victor claims all. Dupree allowed the instant to suspend in the ether. He gazed at Richard's reddened, haughty countenance, and he perceived his opportunity not just to prevail, but to completely annihilate his adversary. He had been supplied data for months by his aide. Data that had arrived directly and covertly from Zeke at Oak Ridge about Richard's conceit, his susceptibilities, and his profoundest cherished principles. Dupree knew precisely which nerve to prod. "Very well," Dupree uttered, his tone descending low enough that only the gentleman at the board could perceive. "We will stake something more precious than terrain or silver. We will stake something singular, a trial of a man's authentic value." He halted, permitting the theatrics to escalate. "I will stake my complete rice yield for the following year and the revenues thereof, against a lone article of your selection from Oak Ridge." Richard erect, his conceit stung. The proposal was both an affront and an irresistible provocation. "Anything?" he inquired, his tone dense with whiskey. "Anything," Dupree affirmed, his gaze sparkling in the candlelight. "Your champion mare, your spouse's renowned pearl choker, even the title to the grand residence itself. You designate it. One round for all." The utter boldness of the stake muted the lounge. This was no longer merely a contest. It was a confrontation waged with fortunes instead of blades. For an instant, Richard seemed to waver, a glimmer of logic piercing the haze of his vanity. But then he captured the sneer on Dupree's countenance, an expression of patronizing sympathy, and his conceit thundered back to vitality, submerging all prudence. He would not be perceived as a craven. He was Richard Beaumont, and he did not forfeit. He pounded his fist down on the board, causing the tumblers to leap. "I consent." The distributor, a man whose expression stayed emotionless as a mortality veil, started to mix the decks. The gentle, fluttering noise was the sole sound in the lounge. The atmosphere was dense with strain, a tangible existence that appeared to distort the flickering candlelight. Richard Beaumont, his conceit now solidified into a veil of bleak resolve, observed the distributor's palms with a falcon's concentration. Across the board, Jonathan Dupree was a portrait in predatory tranquility. He had placed the lure. Now he was merely awaiting to haul in his quarry. The contest was 7-card stud, straightforward, ferocious, and merciless. The initial decks were distributed. Richard gathered his, concealing them with a palm that quivered marginally. He possessed a trio of queens, a robust commencement. A gradual, assured smile extended across his countenance. The first authentic display of delight he had exhibited all evening. He had this. The deities of fortune had not deserted him after all. Dupree examined his own decks with an indecipherable look. He discarded 2. Richard, emboldened by his queens, discarded 2 as well, aspiring to draw another queen or perhaps one more card to form a flush. The distributor glided the fresh decks across the bays. Richard's pulse throbbed in his breast. He gradually, intentionally spread them apart. Nothing, not a lone deck, enhanced his round. He was left with his trio of queens. A round that had appeared so auspicious moments prior now felt perilously frail. A fragment of frost glided into his abdomen. For the first time that evening, a thick shudder of dread coursed through him. "The wager is to you, Beaumont," Dupree uttered, his tone a velvety murmur. Richard paused. To withdraw now would be an acknowledgment of overthrow, and deed of timidity he could not endure. To deceive would be self-destruction against a figure like Dupree. He was ensnared, cornered by his own conceit. He gazed across the board, attempting to interpret his rival's countenance, hunting for any indication of frailty, any revelation. He discovered nothing but the frigid reptilian assurance of a man who possessed a victorious round. Well, Dupree urged the lone term a blade's brink. Richard's intellect dashed. He could not forfeit. He could not permit this interloper Yankee to disgrace him. He had to designate a term so monumental, so inconceivable, that it would unsettle Dupree, perhaps even compel him to retreat. What did he possess that was genuinely invaluable, genuinely distinctive? The residence, the terrain. These items had a fiscal worth. He required something beyond cost. And then, in an instant of whiskey-drenched, arrogant lunacy, the notion arrived to him. It was a stake so distorted, so rebellious, that it could only have been devised in the intellect of a man who had come to perceive the cosmos, and every one in it as nothing more than fragments on his individual contest panel. He straightened his posture, his tone resounding with a counterfeit resounding assurance. "I perceive your stake of a year rice yield Dupree, and I will elevate you. I stake my most cherished resource, the purest entity at Oak Ridge, my daughter Elizabeth." A communal inhalation traversed the lounge. Men who had observed skirmishes at sunrise and brawls in rear lanes. Men hardened to the nonchalant ferocity of their realm gazed at Richard Beaumont in astonished, appalled incredulity. Even Dupree's rehearsed poise stumbled for an instant, his gaze broadening in authentic astonishment. He had anticipated a majestic motion, but this was indeed of profound ethical derangement. "You would stake your own progeny," Dupree murmured, the terms scarcely audible. "She is my asset until she is wedded, is she not?" Richard countered, his tone ascending, becoming protective. "By statute, she is mine to allocate as I deem appropriate. Is that not the bedrock of our whole society? That a man has total sovereignty over his asset. He was no longer just executing a stake. He was safeguarding a perspective, a doctrine of total authority that he had embodied his entire existence." Dupree recuperated swiftly. He perceived the chasm that had unfolded before him, and he did not flinch. He inclined forward, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, a viper's sibilance. "And if you prevail, Beaumont, what do you desire from me in exchange?" The query caught Richard unprepared. In his frantic ploy, he had only contemplated the term, not the reward. What could possibly equilibrium the measure against his own daughter? He gazed at Dupree's smug, victorious countenance, and a surge of unadulterated, unalloyed loathing washed over him. He desired to do more than secure Dupree's currency. He desired to disgrace him. He desired to deprive him of his virility, to imprint him with an indelible symbol of disgrace. And so, the second, and perhaps even more deranged, portion of the stake was birthed. "If I prevail," Richard proclaimed, his tone quivering with a blend of ire and elation, "you will yield to me 4 of your finest harvesters, and you, Jonathan Dupree, will assume their position. You will labor in my rice paddies under my superintendent for 1 complete reaping period. You will reside in the huts. You will consume the sustenance they consume. You will sense the scourge if you defy. You will comprehend what it signifies to be asset." The chamber descended into a lifeless, sepulchral hush. This was no longer a blackjack contest. It was a plunge into insanity. Dupree gazed at Richard, and then he commenced to chortle. It was not an agreeable noise. It was a arid, grating guffaw that was bereft of all amusement. It was the noise of a hunter who has just comprehended its quarry is not only ensnared, but has voluntarily proffered up its own jugular. "You are mad, Beaumont," Dupree uttered, wiping a droplet of amusement from his eye. "Utterly and completely mad. But I am not a man to decline such a spirited stake." He gazed down at his decks, then back up at "accept your conditions. My rice yield against your daughter. My liberty against your conceit. Reveal your decks." With a dramatic sweep, Richard dispersed his round on the board. "A trio of queens," he declared, his tone booming with an assurance he did not sense. Dupree maintained his stare for a prolonged, agonizing instant. Then, with a gradual, intentional motion, he placed his own decks down one by one. A 9, a 10, a jack, a queen, and a king high straight. The hush in the chamber extended for an infinity. The sole noise was the cadenced churning of the paddle-wheeler's wheel, a unyielding funeral rhythm. Richard Beaumont gazed at the decks, his countenance gradually depleting of all hue. The cosmos appeared to incline and glide away from him. The amusement, the haze, the countenances around him, all disintegrated into a senseless haze. All he could perceive were those 5 decks, a flawless deriding progression that articulated his complete and total devastation. He had not just forfeited a contest. He had forfeited his daughter, his dignity, his heritage, and his essence. Back at Oak Ridge, a very distinct kind of plot was forming. For months, Zeke had been utilizing his favored status as a domestic attendant and his covert literacy to coordinate a fragile and perilous scheme. He had been supplying data about his overlord's routines and frailties to Dupree's aide, a man with whom he had a secret accord. It was Zeke who had proposed the paddle-wheeler blackjack contest. It was Zeke who had suggested that Richard's conceit was his most lethal defect, a susceptibility that could be manipulated. Zeke was not simply aspiring for his overlord's downfall. He was vigorously designing it, but his scheme was far more ambitious than merely witnessing his overlord disgraced. He had an objective that was nearly as inconceivable as Richard's stake. He pursued not just to disrupt the hierarchy of Oak Ridge, but to pulverize it and from the fragments construct something novel. He had entrusted in the 3 other men, Elias, Isaac, Levi, and Nathan. He had selected them meticulously, not just for their vigor and aptitudes, but for their communal chronicle of suffering at Richard's palms, and for the hushed honor with which they endured their loads. He had selected them because he knew they could be relied upon. They convened in secrecy in the depths of night, in the shadowy, vast expanse of Isaac's forge. The atmosphere still tepid from the day's blaze. Here, encircled by the implements of their own domination, they crafted a scheme of insurgency. Zeke was the designer, his intellect acute and tactical. Elias was the voice of prudent advice, his maturity and expertise essential mooring to Zeke's youthful blaze. Isaac and Nathan were the brawn, their mute vigor, the pledge of deed. And Levi was the erector, the one who perceived how a fresh framework could be elevated from the debris of the ancient. It is not sufficient that he tumbles. Zeke had contended in one of their covert assemblies, his tone a subdued, pressing murmur. Dupree will merely assume his position. One overlord is substituted by another. Nothing alters for us. We must grasp the instant. We must employ their avarice and their conceit against them. It was Zeke who devised the ultimate bold twist. Through his web, he had proposed the inconceivable conditions of the stake to Dupree's aide, sowing the germ of a notion so outrageous that it could only allure to a man as merciless as Dupree and as haughty as Richard. He had staked on their depravity, on their communal conviction that all was a merchandise, all was for transaction. He had wagered that his overlord's conceit was so immense that he would be willing to place his own daughter on the board, and he had been accurate. When the revelation of the forfeited stake reached Oak Ridge, borne by a rattled and sobered Richard, who tottered home in the pallid glow of twilight, the grand residence descended into a condition of astonishment and frenzy. But in the huts, the revelation, which circulated like conflagration through the whisper network, was encountered with an astonished, fearful, and yet galvanizing aspiration. Something had fractured. The cosmos had been inverted. The inconceivable had transpired. Zeke assembled the other 3 in the forge one final time before the deed was to be performed. Now he uttered, his gaze ablaze with a fervor that appeared to illuminate the obscurity. The authentic stake commences. Our stake. He outlined his scheme. It was alarming in its breadth and its peril. They were about to traverse a boundary from which there was no retreat. They would be grasping control of not just an individual, but of an emblem. In possessing Elizabeth, they were not pursuing retribution in the manner their overlords would comprehend it. They were not planning to brutalize or disgrace her. Their scheme was something far more extreme. They intended to proffer her a selection. She is the latch, Zeke clarified, his tone subdued and steady. As long as she is here, as long as she is lawfully our asset, her sire's authority is fractured. The outrage will immobilize him, and it grants us influence. It grants us a barrier. While the county is in disarray, attempting to comprehend what has transpired, We will act. Their objective was not to retain Elizabeth as a bondsman. Their objective was to employ the juridical absurdity of their possession to bargain the liberty of every man, woman, and child at Oak Ridge. It was a higher-risk venture, a frantic maneuver in a contest where the cost of failure was torment and demise. But for the first time in their existences, they possessed a lone, potent card. Her name was Elizabeth Beaumont. The day the assistants came to hand over Elizabeth, the four men were prepared. Their tranquility, their unified quietude was not born of astonishment. It was the disciplined composure of men who knew precisely what they were executing. When they guided her away from the grand residence, they took her to a locale on the distant fringe of the Beaumont property, a locale few individuals ever ventured. A modest, deserted superintendent's shack concealed deep within a cluster of willow trees on the brink of the bayou. It was a basic three-room hut, but Levi and the others had labored for weeks to ready it. They had mended the ceiling, scoured the surfaces, and equipped it with a basic cot, a counter, and a stool. It was a austere, modest abode, but it was tidy, and it was secure. It was to be her haven and her confinement. When they arrived, Elizabeth, who had not uttered a lone term since departing the abode, finally gazed at them, her gaze probing their countenances for some indication of their intents. Was this where they would enact their vengeance? Was this where the authentic terror would commence? It was Elias who uttered first, his tone a subdued, gravelly rumble. "Miss Elizabeth," he uttered, and the employment of the courtesy was so unanticipated that it appeared to suspend in the ether. "You will not be injured here." Zeke advanced. He gazed directly at her, his look a blend of bleak determination and something that might have been empathy. "We have not done this to injure you," he uttered. "We have done this to liberate ourselves. You are now the centerpiece of a negotiation. Your sire staked you like a possession. We are staking you for the liberty of 300 souls." Elizabeth gazed at him, her intellect battling to grasp the sheer boldness of his terms. These men, who had been her sire's asset just yesterday, were now uttering the dialect of commanders and diplomats. They were not acting out of brute ire. They were performing a computed political strategy. What do you desire from me?" she finally murmured, her tone. "For now," Zeke responded, "we desire you to remain here to be secure and to await. Your sire thinks he has forfeited a stake. He is about to discover that the contest has just commenced." He then pivoted, and with the other three men departed the shack, drawing the sturdy timber portal shut behind them. Elizabeth heard the noise of a sturdy latch being dropped into position. She was solitary, a captive of her sire's bondsman, a captive in an uprising that she was only just commencing to comprehend. And outside in the assembling twilight, the frogs initiated their nightly refrain. A noise that had always appeared tranquil, but now sounded like the ticking of a timepiece, counting down to a clash that would either emancipate everyone at Oak Ridge or witness them all annihilated. The month that followed the handover was an interval of surreal and suspended vitality in Natchez. The societal hierarchy, once as inflexible and unrelenting as the winter chill, had become brittle, permeable. Richard Beaumont lingered isolated in his library, a specter in his own villa, imbibing himself into a condition of oblivious despondency. His spouse, Amelia, glided through the majestic chambers like a phantom, her composure fractured, her sobbing episodes the sole indication of vitality in the muted, resonating abode. The superintendent, Harlan, deprived of his overlord's authority, was a directionless despot, his blustering menaces now bearing the empty chime of weakness. He scouted the fringes of the laborer huts, a rifle cradled in his limbs, but he could sense the alteration in the atmosphere. The dread that had been the foundation of his authority was vanished, substituted by a hushed, disturbing attentiveness. He was being scrutinized, assessed, and he knew it. Revelation of the stake and its result had reached Memphis, where it was encountered with a blend of astonished denunciation and morbid intrigue. The Anglo aristocracy, for whom kin, dignity, and racial innocence were hallowed doctrines, proclaimed Richard Beaumont an outcast. He had not just dishonored himself, it revealed the murky, irrational essence of their whole framework. He had illustrated that the boundary between a treasured progeny and a fragment of livestock was slender enough to be erased by the flip of a deck. Jonathan Dupree, for his portion, became a reluctant luminary. He had prevailed, but the character of his victory was so scandalous that he could not openly commemorate it. He discreetly took possession of the revenues from Beaumont's rice yield. But he made no maneuver to claim the authentic reward of his stake. What, after all, was he to do? He could not lawfully take possession of Elizabeth from the 4 bondsmen who now possessed her. The statute, in its majestic and horrifying absurdity, was on their flank. Meanwhile, in the concealed shack on the brink of the bayou, Elizabeth was existing in a condition of profound and terrifying seclusion. Her preliminary astonishment was yielding to an emerging, intricate comprehension of her circumstance. She was a captive, yes, but her captors handled her with an odd and formal regard. Nathan brought her sustenance thrice a day, basic but nourishing repasts of rye bread, vegetables, and cured beef, the same sustenance consumed in the huts. Levi had repaired a swaying stool he found in the shack and spent a morning meticulously polishing it smooth so she would have a comfortable locale to perch. Isaac stood sentinel at a distance, his colossal form a mute, daunting presence that kept the inquisitive and the superintendent at bay. It was Zeke who became her primary nexus with the strange, fresh realm she now occupied. He came each morning just as the sun was ascending, bringing a torch and a tome from the grand residence archive. He never entered the shack without her consent. He would position at the threshold and converse to her, his tone subdued and tranquil. He was not just her warden. He was her instructor. "My sire once informed me, you do not sense as we do," she uttered to him one morning, her tone barely a murmur. She was perching in the swaying stool, a cover wrapped around her shoulders against the bayou's moist cold. Zeke positioned in the threshold, the torch glow casting elongated, dancing umbras behind him. "We sense everything, Miss Elizabeth," he responded, his tone gentle, but bordered with iron. "We sense the scourge. We sense the chill. We sense the loss of our offspring and our spouses. We sense the disgrace of being handled like a beast. We sense it so deeply that it scorches. For some, it scorches away their essence. For others, it solidifies it into something that can never be fractured." He commenced to narrate tales, the covert chronicle of Oak Ridge that was never chronicled in her sire's records. He narrated her of Elias's spouse, Hannah, traded away for a betting obligation. He narrated her of the sanctuary Levi had desired to construct. He narrated her of the scores of minor daily deeds of brutality and dehumanization that comprised the normal operation of her sire's realm. He conversed without ire, his tone a level, factual recitation of a catalogue of transgressions. And as she hearkened, the realm Elizabeth had known, the realm of exquisite gowns, courteous dialogues, and groomed meadows, commenced to disintegrate, disclosing the alarming blood-drenched foundation upon which it was constructed. She was not just the progeny of a landowner. She was the progeny of a oppressor. And the ornate enclosure she had occupied was constructed from the skeletons of the individuals he had fractured. The apex of this odd, strained intermission arrived exactly 1 month after Elizabeth's handover. The 4 men had utilized the time to solidify their authority. Under the hushed, unchallengeable guidance of Elias, the labor on the estate had continued. But it was distinct now. The unyielding, savage tempo had diminished. The bound laborers proceeded with a fresh sense of intent, a hushed honor that was in itself an act of upheaval. They were no longer laboring for Beaumont. They were laboring for themselves, for each other, for the future they were attempting to grasp. The superintendent, Harlan, was entirely isolated, a monarch without vassals. His commands were encountered with a mute collective denial that was more potent than any overt resistance. He was a man shrieking into a gale. On the 9th day, Zeke delivered the conditions of their negotiation to the grand residence. He did not go to the rear portal as an attendant would. He ascended the primary stairs across the wide terrace and rapped on the front portal. It was opened by a terrified chambermaid who simply gazed at him, her gaze broad. Zeke handed her a sealed packet. "From my overlord, Richard Beaumont," he uttered. His employment of the possessive term, a deliberate, computed irony. The missive was not a entreaty. It was a demand. It was inscribed in Zeke's clear, refined script, the phrasing exact and juridical. It declared that Elizabeth Beaumont was being retained, secure and uninjured, as security. Her liberation could be obtained in exchange for one entity: the lawful emancipation of every bound individual at Oak Ridge. The missive specified that the papers were to be composed by an impartial attorney from Vicksburg, verified by the county registrar, and delivered within 72 hours. If the cutoff elapsed, or if any effort was made to recapture Elizabeth by coercion, the missive concluded with a basic, chilling phrase: "All pacts will be rendered invalid, and the asset will be deemed relinquished." The missive was the ember that kindled the explosive. Richard Beaumont, shaken from his inebriated stupor by this deed of bold insurgency, soared into a seismic fury. He stormed out of his library, his countenance a violet veil of rage. The missive crumpled in his grip. "They dare," he bellowed, his tone echoing through the muted villa. "They dare to make stipulations of me. They are my asset. I will witness them all strung up. I will raise the huts to the earth." He summoned Harlan, the superintendent. "Assemble every man you can trust," he ordered. "Equip them. We are reclaiming her this evening, and we are going to make an exemplar of those four that will be recollected in this county for 200 years. But revelation of the demand had already seeped, circulating through the county with the velocity of a bayou blaze. A modest, somber-faced group of adjacent landowners arrived at Oak Ridge that evening. They were not there to proffer backing. They were there to confine the harm. "You cannot assail them," Richard uttered one of them. An aged, esteemed Anglo named Harlan. "Contemplate the repercussions. You will initiate a conflict, a bondsman revolt. It will not be confined to Oak Ridge. It will extend to all of us. You have generated this chaos with your betting. You must resolve it discreetly. Resolve it." "They're stipulating, I emancipate my bondsman. It's unfeasible." "It would be devastated," Richard raged. "You have already devastated yourself," Richard Harlan uttered, his tone frigid. "Now you are menacing to devastate the remainder of us. Your progeny is the matter. If she is injured, if a white female is slain by bondsmen, the officials will have to intercede. The guard will arrive. There will be a slaughter. But if you assail first and she is slain in the exchange, you will be held accountable. You will be perceived as the man who got his own progeny slain to safeguard his resources. You have no maneuver. They have you in stalemate." Richard gazed at them, his countenance a veil of incredulity. His own kin, his own stratum, were forsaking him. They were not allying with the bondsman, but they were allying against him, against the disarray he had unleashed. He was solitary. But Richard Beaumont was not a man to accept overthrow. If he could not employ overt coercion, he would employ deceit. That evening, under the shroud of obscurity, a distinct kind of clash occurred. He dispatched the superintendent, Harlan, not with an equipped throng, but with 3 other men on a covert operation to the shack. Their objective was not to initiate a skirmish, but to kidnap Elizabeth, to snatch her back and eliminate the insurgents' lone, most precious resource. They proceeded like umbras through the willow cluster, the atmosphere dense with the odor of silt and rot. But the 4 men were anticipating such a maneuver. They were not warriors, but they knew this terrain, every sapling, every patch of yielding soil. Nathan, whose perceptions were as acute as any creature's, heard the faint crack of a branch from a 200 yards distant. Isaac, a mute, murky bulk in the deeper umbras, perceived the sparkle of moonlight on a pistol barrel. The snare was activated. It was not a conflict of gunfire, but of alarming, savage, intimate combat. Harlan and his men stumbled into a snare line Levi had strung between two saplings, sending a torrent of vacant calabashes clattering to the earth. In the subsequent instant, the four were upon them. It was a rapid, barbaric, and nearly mute clash. Isaac, with a lone, potent strike, disarmed one man and rendered him insensible. Elias and Levi subdued the other. Harlan, the superintendent, found himself confronting Zeke. The superintendent elevated his firearm, but Zeke was too swift. He pounced, not with the armament, but with a span of thick cord. The two men tumbled to the earth, rolling in the silt and foliage debris. Harlan was larger and mightier, but Zeke was propelled by a lifetime of suppressed ire. He battled with a frantic, mute fury, and in the conclusion, it was the cord, not a blade or a projectile, that decided the skirmish. Inside the shack, Elizabeth had been roused by the din. She positioned in the center of the modest chamber, her pulse hammering against her ribs, hearkening to the muffled noises of the struggle outside. The groans, the impacts, the nauseating snap of bone against bone. Then hush. A prolonged, alarming hush that extended for what felt like 2 hours. The latch on the portal was elevated. The portal creaked ajar. Zeke positioned there, his attire rent and encrusted with silt, a prolonged, unsightly laceration on his jaw. Behind him, she could perceive the other 3 men and the 4 captured figures, now restrained and muffled on the earth. "It is concluded," Zeke uttered, his tone ragged, breathless. "Your sire attempted to reclaim you," he faltered. He gazed at her, and in his gaze she perceived not the triumph of a conqueror, but the profound essence, profound exhaustion of a man who had been compelled to commit ferocity to acquire his own humanity. Now he uttered, "We have to conclude this, one way or another." The botched kidnapping was the ultimate catalyst. It was a direct bodily clash, and the insurgents had prevailed. The equilibrium of authority at Oak Ridge had not just altered. It had been entirely reversed. The revelation of Harlan's capture circulated through the huts, and the hushed, attentive aspiration that had been simmering for a month finally exploded. It was not a ferocious eruption, but a profound and collective deed of emancipation. The bound individuals of Oak Ridge simply ceased. They placed down their implements in the paddies. The chefs departed the grand residence pantry. The groom attendants let the mules stand unbrushed in their enclosures. The whole economic mechanism of the estate, the apparatus that had operated on their perspiration and blood for eras, ground to a standstill. It was a universal cessation, a mute, total, and terrifyingly efficacious deed of mass peaceful defiance. Richard Beaumont gazed out from his library window the subsequent dawn and perceived the verity. He perceived the vacant paddies, the mute rice processor, the motionless exhaust vents. He perceived 300 individuals positioning in hushed, resolute unity in the expanse between the huts and the grand residence. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow that he was no longer the overlord of Oak Ridge. He was a monarch besieged in his own fortress, his forces vanquished, his vassals in open, unchallengeable revolt. His stake had cost him all. The dawn after the cessation commenced, a fresh and terrible sun ascended over Oak Ridge. It illuminated a realm that had been fundamentally remade. There was no snap of the superintendent's scourge, no noise of the processor grinding rice, no plume of smoke ascending from the pantry vent. There was only an disturbing, profound hush, the noise of 300 individuals holding their respiration, awaiting for the ancient realm to perish. For Richard Beaumont, this hush was the noise of his own condemnation. He positioned at his window, a captive in his opulent home, and perceived his kingdom dissolved. The paddies were vacant. The implements lay where they had been discarded. His entire labor force, the human machinery that propelled his riches, positioned in a mute, unmoving gathering in the distance. They were not rioting. They were not vociferating. Their immobility was their authority. It was the tranquil, inexorable authority of a avalanche, a force against which his ire and his menaces were completely meaningless. He was an overlord with no one left to direct. The ultimate deed of his capitulation was a fragment of spectacle designed for his supreme disgrace. The county attorney, a man whose palms quivered as he executed his obligation, arrived not at the grand residence, but at a basic willow counter established by Levi in the lifeless expanse between the villa and the huts. On one flank positioned the white juridical framework represented by the attorney and a somber-faced county assistant. On the other flank positioned the fresh authority, Elias, Zeke, Isaac, Levi, and Nathan, their countenances sculpted from granite. Richard Beaumont was accompanied from his abode. He was no longer the haughty Anglo-patriarch, but a fractured, shuffling elder man, his gaze vacant, his exquisite attire dangling loosely on his diminished frame. He was compelled to perch at that counter in the open ether under the observation of the 300 essences he had possessed. One by one, the emancipation documents were positioned before him. One by one, he endorsed his designation. The refined, flowing endorsement now a spindly, trembling scribble. With each flourish of the quill, an existence was lawfully reborn. A fragment of asset became a individual. A designation in a record became a designation in the ledger of the liberated. When the final paper was endorsed, Zeke approached the counter. He did not gaze at his former overlord. He gathered the documents, examined them with a scrupulous eye, and then nodded once to Elias. The negotiation was concluded. The stake was secured. Their initial deed as liberated men was to proceed to the concealed shack by the bayou. Zeke elevated the latch from the portal for the ultimate time. Elizabeth positioned inside, awaiting. For 12 days she had been a captive, an emblem, a latch. Now the bolt had rotated. "You are liberated to depart, Miss Beaumont," Elias uttered, his tone imbued with a formal, ultimate solemnity. "Our pact is concluded." Elizabeth emerged into the sunlight, squinting. She gazed at the 4 men who had been her captors, her guardians, and her emancipators. She gazed at their weary, resolute countenances. And in that instant, she comprehended that her ancient existence was as deceased as her sire's lineage. She could not revert to the grand residence. She could not re-enter a white society that would eternally perceive her as a sullied female, the maiden who was traded to bondsmen. Her ornate enclosure was vanished, but so was the realm that had encompassed it. "Where will you proceed?" she inquired, her tone subdued. "West," Zeke responded. "There are settlements, locales where we can commence anew. We depart this evening." A selection lay before her, alarming and emancipating selection. She could attempt to discover a locale for herself in the debris of her ancient realm, an existence of disgrace and murmurs. Or she could step into the unfamiliar. "Take me with you," she uttered. It was not an entreaty. 'Twas a declaration, a proclamation of loyalty, an ultimate, irrevocable rupture with the designation Beaumont and all it symbolized. The 4 men exchanged a prolonged, mute glance. They had not schemed for this, but they perceived in her gaze the same fierce, frantic yearning for liberty that blazed in their own cores. Elias gave a gradual, solemn affirmation. "We depart at twilight." That evening, a mute departure occurred from Oak Ridge. It was not just Elizabeth and the 4 men. It was a procession of nearly 60 essences, entire kin who had resolved to cast their fortune with the insurgency, to hazard the dangers of the voyage west, rather than linger in a terrain that would always perceive them as less than human. They proceeded like apparitions through the obscurity. Directed by Nathan's knowledge of the concealed trails, their few possessions bundled on their spines. They evaporated into the Mississippi bayous, dissolving into the landscape, leaving behind an estate that was now nothing more than a meadow of undergrowth and a abode of apparitions. What became of them? Here the official chronicle, that grand edifice to the orderliness of history, falls mute. The repositories of Natchez note the unprecedented mass emancipation and the subsequent collapse of the Beaumont property. They chronicle Richard's demise in a benevolence infirmary in Memphis in 1856. His cause of demise listed as hardening of the arteries and a fractured essence. Ridge itself positioned vacant and deteriorating for over 2 decades. A regional oddity, a locale youngsters dared each other to penetrate on a starless evening. Then in 1868, during the chaotic ultimate days of the Reconstruction, it burned to the soil. The official account cited a stray cannonball, but the tales narrated in the shacks and sanctuaries of the newly emancipated individuals of the county uttered otherwise. They uttered the terrain was purifying itself, that the blaze was a ultimate, righteous verdict on a abode constructed of transgression. The shocking transfer deed, the paper that initiated it all, vanished from the county registry sometime in the early 20th century, likely extracted and annihilated by someone desiring to erase the uncomfortable recollection to smooth over the fissures in the official account of the Old South. But tales are harder to extinguish than parchment. The narrative of the Beaumont stake endured, but it splintered into myth. In the white populace, it became an admonitory tale about the perils of conceit and betting, a peculiar annotation in the chronicle of a fallen kin. In the black populace, the narrative became an saga, a foundational legend of opposition. It was murmured from one era to the next. A narrative of 4 courageous men and a overlord's progeny who had turned the armaments of their oppressors against them. And in this rendition of the narrative, they did not perish in the bayou. They endured. The most concrete suggestion of their destiny emerged in 1931 when a chronicler researching the chronicles of a Kansas-based Emancipation Society uncovered an assortment of unsent missives from the 1880s. One was inscribed in a fragile schooled script on parchment that had faded with maturity. It was a contemplation on the establishment of a modest, flourishing society of free black cultivators called Haven. The scribe, who endorsed the missive only with the initial E, composed of the adversities of their early decades and of the distinctive guidance framework of their settlement, which was directed by an assembly of 4 seniors. She composed, "We were all of us fugitives delivered from the terrain of servitude, not by a seer's palm, but by a lunatic's conceit and a contest of fortune. Our liberty was acquired with $5, a cost that was both an affront and a wonder. I am the sole white countenance in this settlement, a odd remnant of the realm we fled. But here, my complexion is not a symbol of prerogative, and theirs is not a symbol of domination. We are simply constructors. My 4 sentinels, the men who stake their existences against an oppressor, have become the supports of this society. Elias our arbiter, Isaac our defender, Levi our erector, Nathan our director, and Zeke our instructor, our tactician, our core. They are elder men now. Their tress is silver, but their gaze still possess the blaze of that inconceivable venture. They do not converse of the past, but it resides in the foundations of every abode they have constructed. In the liberty of every youngster born here, we have fashioned our own idyllic vision, not from the perspiration of others, but from the fertile, murky earth of this free terrain. The missive was never authenticated. Haven, if it ever subsisted, does not emerge on any official cartographs. It lingers a specter, a murmur of a potential, a myth. And so, the narrative of Oak Ridge concludes, not with an orderly, documented finale, but with the haunting vagueness of history itself. It is a narrative of how an entire realm can be brought down by a lone deed of arrogance. But what do you think really happened to Elizabeth and those 4 brave men? Was their bold move a tale of raw revenge, or a forgotten masterstroke in the fight for liberty that reshaped lives forever? Drop your theories in the comments below. They vanish into legend, or build a hidden haven that history buried. If stories like this grip you, hit like and subscribe for more unearthed secrets from America's shadowed past. We'll dive deeper into the archives. Next time, stay tuned.